North Coast, thanks for joining us today. My name's Kirk. I'm one of the pastors on staff here at the Vista campus. We are in favorite Jesus stories, and my favorite Jesus story is in the Old Testament, which is kind of cheating the system. I don't think I'm supposed to do this, and hopefully Chris Brown doesn't find out. But our last series was on favorite Old Testament stories, and I didn't do a daily dose on that, so I think I can get away with it. Anyways, I'm going to be in Genesis chapter 50, verse 18, if you want to follow along. It's a story of Joseph. I'll try to sum it up as quickly as I can. Joseph had a difficult life. His brothers gave him a really hard time. They didn't like him. They sold him into slavery. From there, he was obedient, and yet he was wrongfully accused of going after Potiphar's wife. He was thrown in the royal prison. Difficult situation. Again, he was obedient. He had an opportunity to build some relationships and get himself out of that situation. The cupbearer and the baker both forgot about him. He was stuck in jail, and it wasn't until several years into his life that Pharaoh actually heard about him, needed a dream to be interpreted. I think it was the cupbearer that remembered him, and he is finally in the presence of Pharaoh. He interprets this dream that's basically this severe famine is going to hit Egypt, the surrounding land, and if you don't do something about it, lives are going to be affected. Pharaoh responds by appointing Joseph in this incredibly influential position. Because of that, they prepare for this famine, and when it hits, Egypt is able to survive. It's so severe that it hits the land of Canaan, which is where Joseph's family's from. Jacob, their dad, sends the brothers to Egypt to get food. They meet Joseph. Joseph is disguised. He hides himself. He's dealing with a lot of emotions. Long story short, he eventually reveals himself to his brothers. He forgives them. We don't find this out at the time, but they struggle to accept that forgiveness. They really do. Between going back home and returning, eventually the story culminates when Jacob dies and all the brothers are reunited to bury him. And this is how the brothers respond in verse 18 of chapter 50, Genesis. It says, Joseph's brothers then came and threw themselves down before him. "We are your slaves," they said. But Joseph said to them, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." And so Joseph has this beautiful, godlike perspective of understanding, well, it wasn't about me, and it wasn't about how unfair my life is and how I was wrongfully accused and how I was thrown in prison. Joseph says, here's what God did. He used my acts of obedience so that he could put me in this position so that I could then be a part of the saving of thousands of lives that weren't affected by this famine. If that doesn't speak to obedience in our own lives as Christians, I don't know what does. I mean, life is hard, and God says, I want you to wake up and I want you to respond in obedience. And here's why this is my favorite Jesus story. Because if Joseph doesn't take steps of obedience to wind up in Egypt, the Israelites don't follow him. If the Israelites don't wind up in Egypt, incubate in Egypt, become enslaved in Egypt, there is no Exodus story. If there's no Exodus story, there is no Moses. If there's no Moses, there's no Mount Sinai. No Mount Sinai, there's no law. If the law doesn't come to the people, then Jesus is stuck in heaven waiting to come down and fulfill that law. Now hear me. I don't want to get heretical. I fully understand that God is self-sufficient, that he does not need us, that he did not need Joseph to bring about his perfect plan. But I absolutely love that God took these little acts of obedience and he stitched them to the gospel narrative. And so when we wake up in our daily lives, no matter how difficult or how hard it is, we simply need to respond in obedience. And one of my favorite things about this story is no giants are slain. No seas are split. Nobody walks on water. Joseph isn't performing these huge, amazing, massive miracles. He's just waking up and he's saying, God, your will be done. So here's what I want to challenge you to do. No matter how difficult, unfair, complicated your life is, you now have a reason to obey God. It's because he loves you so much that he calls you to something greater. He says, I want you to step out in obedience because through your life, I want to save many lives. Go be an influencer. Go make a difference. Go save spiritual lives. God bless.